Hello? Is this about where I should stand? I mean, does the distance really matter that much, or should I stand?
So if you're studying like you're studying right now and you're speaking at your regular volume, it's fine.
Okay.
You can also lean in.
Oh. Yeah, okay.
Good morning. We're going to start in a minute.
Wow. Let's see. So now we're starting a little late. Do I just not care if I run over that much? Or I don't think I am. I think I'm going to be a little. I would have been a little short, so I think I'll probably end 11:30 maybe. You know. Yeah.
Feel free to run over because then it just runs into the app
And then
and you're on anyway.
I'm on anyway, and I might give the first talk if we don't want to switch out computers or whatever. So yeah.
And then after that is lunch. So it's like
Well, I remember yesterday. Yeah, that was an interesting. Everyone's fighting to get off the panel.
You can, as it turns out. I've been working for a company that's a supplier of like you toast the bread while the bread is toasting. Can't tell anyone the business about this. But you toast the bread, and then you build the rest of the sandwich while the bread is toasting, and then take the meat and the vegetables and the sauce and deposit it on the bread after the bread's finished toasting. Oh no, it's not the Jonathan method. It's the eight Prince Castle intern method of sandwich. I was thinking it was like 10 years out. My boss encouraged me to think about it. So we'll see if McDonald's suddenly revamps how they make sandwiches. They're supposed to drastically improve the quality of your sandwich as well as your other Oh yeah, we came up. They just put 8 interns in a room. They're like, come up with ideas. We're old and we don't know how to do this anymore. And so like we just sat around. And what about this?
ready to go. All right.
Yeah. That was my favorite idea of the entire summer.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second day of Progression Mechanics. We're very happy to have you here. And we're going to kick it off with Tarn Adams. So the Tarn really doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. He and his brother are responsible for a game, several games, but the most famous one being, of course, Dwarf Fortress. Which is, I think it's fair to say, it's a very famous game for its unprecedented complexity and simulation depth. It's the kind of a game that we haven't really seen in the game industry before it came. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Tarn Adams.
Yeah. So I was asked here to talk about the future of games. And I think there's kind of a history of people who do simulation type stuff and talk about emergent narrative. It's a colorful history with a track record, and talking about the future has always been a bad idea. But I'm going to do it a little bit. But with that in mind, this talk kind of ended up focusing, on the past and present a little bit too. So hopefully we'll lead into some interesting stuff. But the beginning will maybe not be interesting. We'll see about that. So for people that haven't seen it before, Dwarf Fortress is a kind of aspires to be a fantasy world simulator. We've got this map here that was generated by the game, and it ran a few hundred years of history on it to get these little symbols placed here. I mean, you notice the text graphics immediately, but there's kind of a whole new world is built every time you play. And we were thinking, well, you'd be able to assume a role in the world, hang on to it for a time, adapt to what you see, change the world, hopefully, and then put that down, and then just do it again. The world persists, and there's the whole picture. And you can continue playing. Now, of course, what we've actually accomplished is a lot less than that. I mean, we do have the world there with the history, but the main mode of the game is a sort of colony management simulation. There's 6 dwarves. I don't know where the 7th dwarf went, wandering off somewhere, but that's a hillside. These are kind of, you see Z slices of the game. So that's the sky off to the right, and we've dug a little fortress on the left. So there's our little dwarves in the meeting chamber with some workshops at the bottom. All the stone that we've dug out piled in the left, and a food with barrels and stuff at the top, and their little living quarters on the top left. And that's the main mode of the game. You kind of indirectly control by suggesting orders, things for them to do, and they kind of go about their lives. Another sort of proto mode we've done in the game is just a kind of a typical RPG where you control one character. And it's from a much more sort of standard roguelike like perspective, like something like NetHack or something like that. And this is a marketplace where people are shouting at you that you can buy a hemp hood. And finally, the last mode of the game we've done is just one that lets you inspect. I don't know if that's legible, barely. I don't know if I can blow that up at all. That's a little too blown up, but basically, you can just inspect the history of the world. Pick a kind of go through a chronology, zoom in on certain events, and it doesn't read very well. It's kind of the ideal would be to have something that reads like a story, but we have nothing close to that. So we started this a long time ago. Again, some of these things didn't. That looks a little better. This is a game I wrote in elementary school. We've been doing this for a long time, my brother and I, and we were inspired coming up to by games like Hack that kind of generated a whole level, but it also had this sort of persistent feature of, they called it a bones file. When your character died, you could go and find it again in a new, and it would save the whole level, and you could find your old character and it would have a ghost or something that you could encounter. And so we got this idea of sort of persistent replayable things that you could experience in that context. But then there's games like Sim Earth that were out around that time, growing up in the 80s and early 90s, and games like Starflight that had procedural worlds generated you could land on. It would zoom in kind of as you landed on it, and you could explore driving around in a little terrain vehicle. It had procedural life forms like people think about today, but this was 30 years ago. There might have been some even before that, I don't really recall. So that was kind of the context my brother and I were working with. You could generate things, they could persist, last, and you could think about not just generating a little level map, but the whole universe. And so that's kind of the arc we saw games on when basically it was great that Rami started with Wolfenstein and kind of went through how that developed, because that's where we diverged from the rest of the universe, basically, in the way that he said, where he kind of examined, where mechanics came from, where things could have gone. I mean, we've been described as kind of being in an alternate Earth where none of the good things that happened with interface and usability and that kind of thing happened to the world, but where we still kind of maintained where we thought games were going to head up at the time. This kind of, I was talking to my brother about this talk before we came in, and I remember now when we were in, it was like 1994, we would go in to maybe buy a new game back when they had the box stores with all the games in boxes. And we had a test where we'd pick up the game and look at the back, and if it had the word chapters, levels, episodes, missions, we had to put it back. It was kind of things were just, we just saw games as being a different thing. I don't know. It was very, we were strange children. But eventually we just started asking for, instead of buying a game, could we buy a graphics library? Could we buy an audio library to write games with? And of course, where we ended up was a strange place. It took us a while to get our footing. That person doesn't have footing at all because they're some kind of generated cat creature that's standing on their hands. And you can see what we mean by leaving interface and usability behind with the icons on the right. So we had this kind of really bad procedural animations for this game. You could stand on one hand and one foot, and it would kind of do the thing for you. This was in 2000 up to 2005, but kind of dropping off as Dwarf Fortress took over. And we had this bad idea to kind of build the whole setting from the ground up, because that's what we wanted to do, right? We wanted to just build an entire universe you could live in, but you could zoom in on that character and it would tell you how curly like hairs were on their arms and stuff, and give you like all the boiling points and melting points of every tissue and temperature and nerves and things. And there were spells that could like remove a finger and teleport it somewhere and stuff, and it would change the model and all that. It was just, but it wasn't a game at all. It wasn't fun. So it's like there's something missing there. And so we stepped back and started working on a side project, which eventually took over the whole game for us. That was a lot more standard, and it's like, at least for the audience we were dealing with, things like dwarves, elves, and goblins came for free, right? So if we were going to generate a whole setting, we could at least start somewhere familiar and kind of work out from there, and hopefully get a little more, and sort of start top down with the world and so forth, kind of flesh things out as we go. So here's the first of two, I believe, slides I need to apologize for. There's the player with the P on their belly, and this basically encapsulates sort of more or less insultingly everything Emily talked about. It's like there's plot and story elements in games, and there's a lot of nuance to it. This just looks like some kind of silly branching thing. What I really mean to say is, if you go to a Wikipedia article for many games, you'll see a plot section, you'll see a gameplay section. There's a lot of nuance and interplay there. It's very intricate, and it's a lot of what makes people sort of happy about games, and our problem is that we got rid of that. So what is it that makes the game work for people? I mean, it's like, as mentioned in the introduction, there's kind of like, it's a complex simulation. It has a lot of moving parts, and the moving parts have moving parts. And, that's something. And we have procedural generation, right? I mean, we have all these weird things. You can generate mechanics, you can generate pieces of pieces, and all kinds of variations of things, and none of that is going to give you an emergent narrative, not at all. You can get an emergent narrative from a simple game, and this will give you nothing. So let's talk about that a little bit here, this poor unhappy player. So you can get an emergent narrative from any game because a person can tell you what happened, right? I mean, it's like two chess players. You can be very excited about the reveal and the skewer and the fork and all that kind of thing. Different sacrifices and all that stuff. But what I'm kind of talking about is outside of the game's like own internal logic. If you could just go up to your friend and talk to them about what happened, would they understand? I mean, there's of course some kind of shared knowledge that we're still working with when we talk about things like dwarves and stuff like that, but more so than specific openings or something like that. And also in the talk not emphasized is the fact that we are in a game. Things like balance matter, things like the flow of the game. Is it too challenging? Is it not challenging enough? These things you have to consider very carefully, and the game doesn't work if you don't have them. And I mean, it depends on the kind of experience. If it's purely an exploration game, of course, I mean, you don't have to worry about challenge or balance in certain cases, but you do need to think about the player experience. We don't do that enough with Dwarf Fortress, but we do think about it a lot, whether it feels that way or not. Natural segue to this slide. So let's talk about how this works. Here's a game. It's called Birds and Bugs. It's not a real game. It's just a slide I made and copy-pasted a bunch of ladybugs at the bottom with paint. But let's think about it like, and there's a lot of things you can imagine this game being. Is it something like SimAnt, or is it, something entirely different. So I was thinking about, say like a wildlife documentary or something, right? So, how would you go about making this game so that you get those kind of moments out of it? You have to think about what those moments are, and that's part of the method that we use to think about how to add Dwarf Fortress game mechanics. So I mean, it's not quite phrased like an Attenborough phrase, but it's a flock of sparrows landed and ate most of the pill bugs, but one managed to survive to lay some eggs. It's dramatic, right? That's the kind of thing that happens in a nature documentary, probably over a longer period of time than one sentence, but we want that to happen in our game. So if you want that to happen in your game, what we did with Dwarf Fortress, even as teenagers, we were kind of passing books back and forth. We'd write little story paragraphs to each other and look at them. And now we've kind of formalized that on our web page. There's my brother who goes by the name Three Toe online after his guinea pig, has. Stories that we put up there, and then we've analyzed, and the analysis is usually about as long as the story, and it looks something like this. So there's a lot of things implicit in this sentence, right? We need the flock of sparrows to come from somewhere. We said sparrows, but are there species of birds? How is that? How are they stored? What do we know about them? When we say landed, are they on? What do we understand about the landscape? We don't know. This arrival process, how does it work? Is there some larger simulation, or do they just kind of appear with the roll of a dice or whatever, or die? Yeah, that's how it works. And then what this feeding behavior, we want something dramatic to pop out of that, right? We want there to be possibility of survival. But where's that coming from? Is it coming from the little roll up in the ball? I mean, Pillbug, I don't even know if you saw the picture, right? Because it's a different name everywhere. Like different counties of England have different names for the Pillbug, and they're all darling names. But it just rolls up in a little ball, right? I don't know if that helps when the sparrows come. It'd be something worth looking into, I guess. But some of them, as long as you have some kind of mechanic where there's something survives and something doesn't, that'll get to work. And then lay some eggs is a loaded sentence or phrase. How does this happen? Is there a whole sort of mating procedure, and then pillbugs go off and lay their eggs somewhere? And I always imagine bugs just laying the little eggs like you see most of them. Pillbugs don't do that at all. Pillbugs have a brood pouch they store their eggs in, and then they hatch within the pillbug, and it's like those scorpions you sometimes see with the little scorpions on their back. The pillbugs have these little pillbugs that they live down here, and they carry them around for a little while, and it's darling, right? So we put it in. We got to put that in the game. You need to have some flavor or character to the game. So we got brood pouch mechanics down the lower right. But these are the decisions of sort of what mechanics to go with. And you think like, okay, I'm making this nature documentary. I would have come up with that, and it's true. I mean, these are the things that naturally pop out of the game, right? But there's some process you have to go through. The story thing works for us, and we don't always formalize it like that, but it just gets you your story, story beats or whatever they call them. We get the story there. The Roman numerals are just the order that things might happen, and you have this sort of merging of the story that the player is experiencing or imagining in their head, where the things that were going on earlier with the reproduction interacted with this feeding behavior to produce this dramatic moment of survival. And that came out of the mechanics you built, but you saw that it was going to happen because you were thinking about the stories in advance that the player would see. I mean, procedural generation in general, imagining and drawing some examples of even like a map or whatever you're working on will help you to build it so that thing happens. So we have this thing here. And now the reason that you do this is so that this doesn't happen. This is very common when people work on simulations, right? The overemphasizing the small details and things you might be really fascinated by. I mean, I'm kind of interested in the answer to that question now. I don't know. When they're like crawling around on logs and stuff, they eat some things but not others. I don't know. You could look it up and probably find it in some like entomology journal or something, and put it in your game and work on it for 2 months and then wonder why you did. It's easy to get lost in there, and so thinking of the story that the player is seeing is a way to avoid this kind of thing happening. Dwarf Fortress, we had this problem. That's our equivalent of pillbugs here. When we added academic research to the game in world generation and then leading into the fortress mode, you have libraries around the world. Scholars come, they research from kind of this tech forest of some hundreds of different technologies, and they have apprentices that they raise up, and they share things and move between universities and visit taverns and in your fortress, and you can build a library and name it and have visiting scholars come, and they'll research and might even say they've discovered traction benches or something, right? But the problem, and we just didn't get time to do it, and you kind of knew this was going to be a problem, is the traction bench is already an item you can use in the game, and the fact that they invented it was something we couldn't really link in time. And sometimes they invent things like padlocks, which are just not in the game at all. And so you end up not interacting with your core mechanics. I've drawn kind of a little benzene circle there to say that the linkages between these mechanics are strong and interesting there. But the story doesn't flow into the actual mechanics of sort of day-to-day experience of the player. And you get some interesting moments. People will kind of say, oh, hey, there's this interesting thing I found in World Generation where someone refused an apprentice 4 times, and then that person went on to become a necromancer or something, right? And they can kind of make a story in their mind about what happened. And it's interesting, but it's just a thread, and it doesn't tie into the rest of the game. So it's sort of a failure and ongoing experience in that regard. Whereas maybe surprising for people that haven't played the game, sculpture is a sort of a almost unforeseen game mechanic that really centralized itself as part of the game. I had someone email me a story. I've seen a few of these, so I'm gonna just completely make up the details as I go because it's gonna be all interwoven. But basically, there was a fortress, and one of our kind of 2 common story parts is the whole kind of digging too deeply down underground and the monsters come kind of thing. And so there were demons all through the fortress, and they were losing badly. And this is part of the reason the motto of the game is losing is fun, because you're supposed to press on and then continue with the world, right? So they were experiencing the fun part of the game. And so the demons were causing trouble, and there was a demon that had kind of had a name, and names are really important to kind of build a character. And one of their dwarves struck down this demon it's kind of the bridge. It was almost like a Lord of the Rings thing, but of course they built the bridge themselves, so it has even more meaning. And their dwarf that did that fell into the bridge was over something, right? So it was just onto a rock cliff and splat, broke their leg, and was the last dwarf left alive, kind of starving to death down at the bottom of this chasm. And of course you could just wait, I guess, if you just wait to end the game, or you can retire the fort immediately right then. And the demons had kind of taken over, but they couldn't get down there, or didn't care. Poor guy. And then, but the person said, okay, I'm going to designate a wall engraving job and let that dwarf do it. And so the dwarf carved into the wall, at the very end of the game, an image that it's a text game, but you can just look at the description, and it was the dwarf striking down the named demon on the bridge. And so when they told this story, and they were just moved by it more than they had been in any game that they had played before, it was sort of a story of defiance, say, right? This last moment, but they could have easily put their favorite food there or something, right? It could have been a story of I like mushrooms. And it does have some biases to like pick historical events that are important, but you can't always do that, or every engraving ends up being the same, right? So, the story could have gone any way, but it was a key game mechanic, the sculpture, because it relates to all of these things I've got listed on the slide. The history that it showed there, the personality of the dwarf is involved, the location that it happened, and the fact that the bridge and the chasm, that kind of thing, the items and materials and jobs when you're doing sculptures that maybe aren't in that exact circumstance, but they all come into play to allow the story to flow freely through your game and be all interlinked. So it's important to think about things like that, or to nurture them when they arise. This is one that we didn't see, but when people started doing stuff like that, we nurtured this. Now, sometimes you do get into this situation with like the academic books where it is, it's a dead end mechanic right now. It's not dead end, you can fix it, but you put some flavor text. You see the little scroll bar maybe on the right there, some hundreds of these. I started getting the names for books just off from my math books that were on the wall, but these were not the names of there might be like Algebra, A Brief Introduction or something, but there wasn't like Can Algebra Save the World? I just started making them up after a while, but So people, when someone does invent traction benches and starts writing books about them, at least there'll be some amusing book, and then the book can kind of go through. People, find it, and it's just adding a little bit of flavor. But anytime you patch flavor over a problem like this, when we actually go to do book titles that are stored in some kind of linguistic system in the ideal future, we'll have to delete this or adapt it or do something with it. And so when you patch flesh over an unfinished mechanic and then you put the skeleton of the next thing through, then it just turns your game into a weird zombie thing, and you have to throw parts out and stuff. It can be frustrating, but sometimes you have to do it. So we've talked about selection of game mechanics, but this doesn't include the player's role. What is the player doing? Because what kind of emergent narrative you're going to get is completely dependent on what the player is. So you can have the player be something, like in a role-playing game, then they're practically a mechanic themselves. It's sort of a roguelike principle that creatures are players, so they use all the same variables, and it just makes everything work nicely together, and then you get this kind of situation where we have our little gear player there with a roguelike @ symbol, which usually represents the player. Or you can have the player as sort of just inspector of story. It's a game they don't interact with in any kind of way that changes the state of the world, but they're just looking around for things. Or you can have the player sort of guiding the larger actions. It's not 100%, split there for us, but this is more or less how we think of these modes of the game. So it's important to have an idea to conceive of the player in a certain way to understand how your emergent narrative is going to work. So for Fortress mode, one of the things that comes up with indirect control is the sort of mining designation. So this is the beginning of the game, and the player has, the player was me, and so I just made this random picture here of random kind of rooms and so forth. Those little ones at the bottom might turn into living quarters, and then there might be a stockpile and so forth, like I talked about. But I understand what these things are because I created them. At least if I were playing the game legitimately, I would be really invested in what those rooms are. And so things that you make are things that you're kind of thinking about when you're using indirect control become centerpieces for emergent narrative. And so giving the player a way to sort of own these spaces that they create. Here's an example from my forum of an inn that somebody made. It has 2 stories. You can see on the top right there's this yellow wall with, it might be a little hard to read, but there are little different symbols there in yellow. That's a sort of panel of engravings that they made, and each of those engravings they can look at, and they maybe even specified what they are. There's tables at the top on that second floor looking down over the main room where people are going to be dancing and singing and doing little things down there. There's a kitchen at the top, 8 rooms for people to stay. There's meal service down at the bottom. And it's a place that, and it'll have a name. I didn't look in the thread to see what the name was, but this place is well understood by the player as a place where story happens. When things happen in there, when they're retelling the story to their friends, they can include anything that they think about this space in that story, and they're more likely to notice it happening. And so this mining mechanic connects to everything, not just the locations that they can create, but it's also a form of exploration. It's a source of disasters if they aren't paying attention and they disconnect the rock and it collapses on them. It's a source of wealth for the whole engine of the fortress to get up and running, jobs they can do. If their exploration happens to find some kind of cave bear or something, then the pick that the miner has suddenly becomes involved in the combat system of the game and so forth. And it's thematically appropriate for the dwarves to be mining. It's what people expect out of the game, and so we get a wealth of story from that. And so it's good to find those central mechanics and think about them in a way that you can just get sort of story moments flowing through your game. Now, the player role where you're just inspecting, you can kind of help that along. We haven't done a good job with this, as I said, but this is the Legends mode again. This is a story of a battle that happened in the year 59 called the Routed Onslaught. It looks like 220 goblins attacked, and almost all of them died, and all of the dwarves were killed, and there are 5 pet giant bats, which is very sad. But I mean, it seems like the Routed Onslaught's an appropriate name because only 18 of the goblins survived, but the name is just random. I mean, you get lucky names like that sometimes. There's a description of what happened. And when it says it's part of that fierce conflict, you can kind of go back and look at that. And so you kind of give them a way to look through, and we kind of imagined in the future maybe giving some kind of crystal ball mechanic where you can kind of just zoom around the map and maybe ask the ball questions and find where things are happening in the world. If you're not the type of person that really wants to play a game, period, where you're sort of having stakes or something, or your fortress is on the line, or you're really kind of limited in scope as a single RPG character. There's no reason the game can't be played entirely just as a sort of exploration of what's going on, and you'll find interesting things happening, especially if you have good ways to query the system for that. So when we're back in the fortress mode again, this kind of when you're thinking about what the player can do and their role, you have to be careful again. There's ways to destroy the characters in your story if you don't respect their autonomy. So we have this kind of principle. We talk about dwarven autonomy. They're allowed to do what they want, and the player can't inject thoughts into their head. And there's kind of this barrier where you can suggest jobs. You can say that they're urgent, and then the dwarves will think there is an urgent job, and someone really ought to do it. But I'm drinking right now. It's just, and so they'll still be themselves, especially if their personality suggests that they would ignore a job like that, then they will act like themselves. Whereas more dutiful dwarves, could go pick it up. And we're thinking about, you might have, if you want to have more control, you can still formalize it if you're some kind of spirit, that's my ghost. As a mechanic in the game, controlling and possessing dwarves, something like Dungeon Keeper, right? You can click on an imp, control the imp, and run it around, bang on the walls a little bit. And they had that formalized in that game, I believe, as some kind of possession mechanic, right? So it's the kind of thing you can conceive of in a way that doesn't destroy the story that you're building. It's part of the story. I was the overlord, I possessed the imp. It's something you can say. And for us who don't, we don't necessarily want to focus on that, we're thinking of sort of formalizing the idea of how the city government works. Ideally, there are not too many commands in Dwarf Fortress, and so if you lay down like a mining designation, it could say associate that to your. Currently, we have an expedition leader, manager, mayor, whoever might have been responsible for that could be tagged with that player action, so that if there's a cave-in, there's somebody to blame. And it's not the abstract player, it's that dwarf over there. And then that could become part of the story. So that's kind of how we're thinking of doing it, and sort of the roadblock to that is the linkage between commands and dwarves. It's just one of those annoying things you have to do 50 times or whatever. So that's something to consider, kind of like this whole, what is the player, trying to get it as systematized as possible. Now, there's a lot of nuance, though, to autonomy. We have, is that legible? Is this one of those ones we might want to pop up? Here we go. So when you make an engraving or a statue or even like a little inset on a hilt or something like that, we recently added the ability to override kind of letting the artist just make what they want. It's important for the game for them to make what they want, but sometimes people really just kind of want a symbol of their fortress, or they want a particular thing in a room, something like that makes sense to them, right? And there's no reason to not let them do that, but at the same time, you don't want them like crawling in the dwarf's brain and making that thing. So what we did is kind of this commissioning artwork. You can go ahead, and the default option is to let the artist choose, but you could also relate it to something that you want. If you want the mayor's room to have something related to the mayor in it, then you can say do that, and they'll pick some random historical event, something the mayor likes, and put it in the room. Here's an example, of building one yourself. I just made this before the talk. The trustworthy shield is an image of a rectangular shield and a human. The human is raising the shield. And just using this list on the left, built that image in a screen that looks like this. Right now, the options are limited because those verbs are understood by the game as meaning things. So we just have a list of them, and most of them are sort of terrifying because that's just kind of how the game started. Let's move on. Okay, so I guess I have to talk about this. It's not the focus for us doing multiplayer games. Never was something we did growing up and just didn't get into it. Probably if we were born 10 years later, it'd be something that we were more attuned to. But there is multiplayer in Dwarf Fortress, and it happened on its own. people just pass their worlds around. And you have a save game, you generate a world, you can say, hey, look at this. I say started a fort there. This is the most common one. It's called a succession game, and this is all player created. You take a fortress, play it for a year. Maybe you're on a forum or something, so you get signups. You can give a dwarf, you can't change their name, but you can give them a nickname. Maybe you self-insert, maybe you put one of your friends in there, just take suggestions. And then as the players are passing that around, giving each other nicknames, putting themselves in there, then things start to happen to them. People on the forum get married, people on the forum get crushed. Different things happen, and it's just sort of this meta narrative of what's going on in the fortress or on the forum interlinks with what happens in the fortress. So we kind of gave them some tools like the nickname to further encourage this to happen. It's things to kind of keep in mind when you're seeing what sort of meta games pop out of your community. Is really more of thinking about community management and so forth, and how that relates to the stories you're eventually going to get. This one is some people find really interesting places to place a fortress, and it's not like every world can't be equally interesting. We try, but sometimes people find a really neat spot, and they'll put it on a forum or a website and say, hey, everyone check this out. Let's all play a fortress there and see what happens. And you can get multiple people, and they can report back. That's another way to kind of interlink these kind of narratives. And in general, you can just pass a world around, take your fortress, play it for a while, retire it, start an adventure somewhere else, move to that fortress, retire, unretire the fortress, and your adventurer is running around in there, and you retire it again, play another adventure, go talk to your old adventurer, all that kind of thing. Do that between multiple people, and who knows what happens. I'm not really sure what's going on in all the different communities. People can kind of invent their own multiplayer games. And so the last kind of part here, and what I guess this is introductory before we talk a little bit about future stuff with the time we have, is just when you have the player, you know what their role is now, or at least you're thinking about it. You have your selection of features, but we have to understand a bit about where the actual story elements are come from. How does the player in that role see the elements? If they're in a kind of RPG, you kind of, just maybe from experience how it works. You have different ways of interacting with the game directly. Things are happening. You're absorbing the story, and you're a character in it. So it's you can kind of see your place. If you're inspecting the game in Legends mode, the story is the one you're building from things that you're interested in. And in Fortress mode, you can push story actions and push narrative structure by doing indirect actions, and then just kind of hopefully the interface helps you along as you're scrolling around and you're getting announcements and things, what kind of things you see. And there is, I believe Emily said in her talk, just this sheer amount of information we're dealing with very quickly becomes just like this massive data stream. And sometimes you have solutions, and sometimes you just data dump on people like this. This is when you look at a dwarf and you want to say, what's the personality of this dwarf? What's going on? The dwarf is giving us this. It has their what they're thinking right now, what's their most recent action, their civilization and religious affiliations, their appearance, their likes and dislikes, their sort of cultural values, and then all of the things, the sort of personality facets. And we help them a little bit. We order these by how much they deviate from the norm. So when it says in the last big paragraph at the bottom, which you may or may not be able to read, he prefers to be alone. That is the most sort of far out thing that person has, and that will characterize their actions. If you see them walking down a hallway, they're not going to talk to other dwarves as much. They're going to spend more time in their room and not go to the bar all the time, if you make a bar. And you'll kind of notice this dwarf being themselves if you inspect this, and it'll help your building of the story. But it is a massive sort of data stream to take in, and kind of part of the reason that we started this project with the whole dwarves, elves, goblins thing. It's like the most boring thing you could do, but at least it cuts down on the data stream. And when you're not cutting down on the data stream, you get stuff like this. This is a randomly generated creature, kind of directly inspired by that Starflight life form that I showed you from 30 years ago. These are completely randomly generated creatures. This is a huge feathered flatworm that crawls up from the water, and it has rosy feathers and deadly blood, and it named it the Sunken Gristle, which is nice. Sunken is a watery word, and gristle is a blight-associated word, which is the things that it it has here water, caverns, and blight. So this is all kind of linked together to create a coherent creature, but it's something that if these were the normal creatures in the game, say your fortress was a bunch of these flatworms burrowing into the ground, not nearly as a compelling a game. It's a strange game, but you'd have to like sort of onboard people into that weird universe, right? But this is a special creature, shows up rarely, and it gives you a big pop-up like this, so you can kind of, okay, this is what I'm going to deal with for the next couple weeks or whatever. This is the monster that's here now, and you can kind of adjust. So this is my second slide that I need to apologize for. There are people in this room, sitting in the front row even, that have written papers on human-computer interaction and have models about that. And this is kind of like my, you know, feral person out in the woods way of thinking about it. The player gets alerts, announcements, this exclamation point. That's one way to feed a potential. I've grayed out the normal green background here of the scroll. I don't know if anyone knew that was a scroll this whole talk instead of like a snake like someone thought it was. But anyway, so this potential story moment, right? It can arrive in the form of announcement, like you get the announcement at the bottom of the screen that, you know, this dwarf and this dwarf have just gotten married. Then that's something that's potentially meaningful to you, but maybe not. There's also the eyeball is just kind of the more passive way of storytelling. You can have visual things going on the screen. You can hear something. Not in our game, you can't hear a thing, but except for my same 4-minute track looping over and over and over. But you know, just in general, there's sort of things that people can pick up on. And then the question mark is actually sort of the most intrusive one. It's when you have to make a decision. That's a potential story moment, but the person might not care. We've deferred some decisions like that to kind of the petition system now, where they can make a decision. It just tells them there's a petition waiting, but they can ignore it if they want. Now, what you do with that is, you know, you can take an action. Then you absorb that story element. That means you're kind of taking it up. I mean, it may be something you were forced to do, don't want to do, but mostly you're playing the game, hopefully, and enjoying yourself. And you absorb this story moment, and you can act on it and turn it into a further linked up narrative where you decide to respond to this thing. So maybe you respond to the marriage announcement by giving them a bigger room, something like that. Or you're like, oh, I like these dwarves, and start adding something to the room, and it becomes something that happened in your fortress. You can also just absorb the moment, add it to your head, story, this is what's going on, kind of the most probably common thing just as you kind of building up your story. And something that's maybe a little more, I wouldn't say unique at all, but just a little more kind of related to what we're doing is the ability to inspect a story that you see this thing, you see the marriage announcement, say, and you want to know more about, say one of the dwarves was one of your favorite dwarves. People often get attached to say their miner because their miner is doing a lot of work in the beginning of the game, and it's a dwarf that you get to know their name, you get to know what's going on. If something bad's happening to them, your fort's going to stop. So you figure it out. But then say your miner marries a cheesemaker, which is typically the dwarves that get put on you know, horrible duties and so forth because people don't care about making cheese. They just don't want to be bothered with all of the different industries that go into making cheese. And so the cheesemaker, and so you were like, you want your miner to be happy, so let's go check out the cheesemaker. And so we offer you ways to inspect the different dwarves in the fortress. I'll show you a little bit later. So you can kind of make that couple happy if you want. And of course, you know, maybe this moment just was lost on you, and you walk off and do something else. That's fine. It's going to happen, especially if you have more stuff going on in the game and people have different interests. And hopefully they'll just keep playing, find something that interests them. If you find them bouncing too much, then of course you have a really big problem. But this is kind of my my little diagram of how I kind of think about things. So here's an example of inspecting. There's a screen here where you can examine the relationships, and this is short because this is the beginning of a test game that I quickly set up when I realized I wanted this slide. But that thing can be a couple pages long when you have historical cousins and uncles and all kinds of things on the list. And you can use that to figure out things about a dwarf and kind of understand what's going on in your fortress. And oftentimes this is just for story purposes, for people who want to recount what's going on in the fortress and get some extra detail. And we give them the tools to kind of look and zoom around for things like that. There's also these sort of explicit logs, like if you see a dwarf fighting, you know, hunting a deer or something over in the corner, most of the time you don't care exactly how that went down. But if the dwarf is, say, injured, then for story purposes, you might want to go figure out, did the deer gore them? Did they accidentally, just do something stupid? What happened over there to cause the dwarf to become injured? And then you can go inspect these gratuitously detailed combat logs to kind of aid you in telling the story. And we're kind of toying around with a new way of doing this, because it's kind of like just plain chronology is boring. I mean, it's kind of the very beginning of how a story would actually look if you're trying to build it. And this is the myth generator for Dwarf Fortress that's not in the game yet, but is coming, where the top paragraph there describes where the dwarves came from in this myth, but you can click any item on the right and it'll recenter the myth in a legible text, so that it explains where that thing came from. So this is how the dwarves understand themselves. You'll see there that it doesn't say where the elves came from because they don't care. It's and so the dwarves think of the world this way, and what we're hoping to do with this is to sort of incorporate elements of that myth into the generated dwarven culture, so that you kind of see it throughout, so they really do seem like that they care about this kind of thing, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So last thing to kind of think about with the player sort of taking in the story is that I don't want to say more often than not, but quite a bit they won't actually understand what happened in the simulation, because like we say, it's a huge data stream, and they're not. I mean, some of it depends on being computer savvy to understand like why this happened. That doesn't stop people at all. Like they're going to, even if they miss a mechanic, they'll come up with some long elaborate thing that happened. There's all the little blue scrolls there, just kind of spinning a story about how it was secretly this person's grudge with their cousin that caused them to go and yell at this person, which caused that person to then put a mandate down saying no more rings can be exported from the fortress or something like that, when it was actually just one coin flip that caused that to happen. But because they saw those dwarves in proximity to each other and they saw that the argument happened, they build up this narrative. And I'm sure you've seen this happen in every sort of game all the time, people coming up with things. And it's really what we lean on. This is them coming up with a story, and it's the story in their head is the only thing that matters. That's what they're going to tell people. So, and it kind of gets to the whole question of, how deep should your simulation go? Should they always be able to see the simulation running? Our kind of, napkin way of thinking about it is, there should be the layer that they see and maybe one layer underneath that they don't really understand, can't think about, but it keeps things consistent. But if you're going down into the pill bug leaf matter area, then you're wasting your time. So something like that. But there's a lot of, it's all case by case. So this is, in the end, what we get is a world that's like the NetHack Bones file, except you're kind of pushing things in, pushing things out. It's not just one story, but a series of stories people can tell about this world, like chapters in a book, and kind of the what we were going for and what we've partially accomplished, and how we thought about it and why it's more than just making a simulation. It's a crafted thing, and it's kind of what you need to think about when you're undertaking this kind of stuff. So we'll talk now in the last bit about sort of the dangerous part of the talk, like I was saying, future stuff a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about customization. So right now they can customize their world with parameters. This is kind of the idea that if you don't want just the dwarf elf setting in a sort of European kind of looking place, that same old, that you can change that, and people do. Sometimes people swap out the entire set of fantasy races and put in humans with different names and kind of say, this is my Rome mod for Dwarf Fortress, and it's a total conversion, and there's no fantasy elements at all. And it's cool because then they can tell stories about that. It's great when they can customize things. And what we're hoping to do is allow more intuitive control of that. So you could say, how random do you want the game to be, or how fantastical is a related question do you want the game to be? If you slide the slider all the way over to the right, it'll give you, your dwarves are gone. You're controlling, six-legged creatures, you know, in some sort of organic substrate that you're digging through. I mean, we still rely on having the digging mechanics because that's what's in the game right now, but it would explain it in a completely different way. And we're kind of looking at how the myth generator can easily be leveraged to make this happen. Because we'll talk again about the myth generator in a bit, but you know, how can you use this growing up of features to make things like this possible? And if you slide it all the way over the other way, it can just cut content, get rid of your dwarves, and have an all-human world if you want. And then there's tone issues. It would be nice as we get more sort of non-combat mechanics, we have quite a bit now, that you can kind of delete parts that you don't want, and not just for like parental control reasons, but because people don't want to play games like that where, you know, weird things are happening to your tendons and then it tells you all about it. It's it's like, so it involves cutting mechanics, you know, bending certain mechanics, and I have the triple line there. There's certain things that need to carry the weight, right? If you're cutting all these potential story builders out, then the player is going to be bouncing more between, say, the social simulation part of the game, and we can only partially carry that now. And so you need to build that up more. So these sliders, these tone sliders, are harder to put in than just the randomization sliders. But we're hoping to, as we can support more things, to put more of that in. And on the flip side, once you understand your creatures well enough, like we have, you know, 50-something personality facets and intellectual values and all kinds of things that you can just set, then you can imagine kind of going back to the things that we were disinterested in as children, allowing people to do like fan fiction stuff, dropping characters in to this system that can understand them pretty well, and seeing what happens. I mean, they're not going to have the same tone of voice, which is why, I mean, it doesn't really, you know, quite work, but it starts to get to the point where it works well enough to be entertaining. And you see, you saw from the sort of TV tropes demonstration that just describing what's going on is pretty funny if you understand what the things are. And so if you have your own fan fiction character in there, you will understand, you know, what's going on and why they're doing the things they're doing. If you just put the jealousy all the way up or put the greed all the way up, then they'll act kind of how you expect them to act, right? And then it'll form an entertaining story. And so we're hoping to get into that as well, maybe exploring that when we do the myth stuff. So yeah, about that. What we're hoping happens here is that the mechanics of the creation myth create the mechanics of the next part of the game. And then when it makes the map, and this already happens to a great extent, when it makes the map, it's kind of laying out how that game is going to work based on how the cities are placed and all that kind of thing. And then, you know, as history passes, you add more possibilities to the game. And then in play, the important thing for stories is the ability to change things and the ability to sort of resolve conflicts. And the more we tie in the mechanics from the beginning to the end, then there could be some sort of, say, magical disaster. All the magic starts working, and then the player can fix that somehow or not fix it, or see what happens when suddenly, you know, people don't, you know, can't speak to the gods anymore or something like that. It'd be, you know, kind of dramatic to be able to cut and re-add features and just see how the little simulated agents deal with it. And we're kind of like right on top of that, and that's what's coming next. We feel like we're finally ready to start taking these things on. So here's the myth paragraph again. Now, if you look at the bottom, or I'll just say what's there, these dwarves, when you have this story, they came from this sort of force in the universe called the Timeless Judgment in this story. And so it created a magic system based on that. It said some of the dwarves can interact with the Timeless Judgment. They learn it like walking, so it would just say that they can do it quite easily. They don't need to go to magic school. But to use it, they need to carve something called a fate runestone. It doesn't say why they know this. That would presumably be part of this generator. And then they use the runestone to seize the Timeless Judgment. It just comes up with the verb that's valid for that kind of thing. That causes them to lose a single memory. Now we put in different spell costs and things that it generates that are things that we could already know we can manage. We have memories in the game. Cut one out. There it goes. So they start to lose their identity, and they also become sort of spectral over time. So what you'll see coming out of world generation in a world like this is that there's a few wizards that are kind of becoming spectral and forgotten, but they've also done a lot of amazing things, which is whatever's below this scroll bar that you can't scroll down to see what that power of magic actually does. But, you know, just imagine any power that's, I mean, we already support a bunch of sort of magical powers in the game. Mostly stuff like people throwing fireballs and poisoning each other and raising the dead as normal, but we'll branch out. So this is the myth that we saw on that slide looks like this. This is what happened, and it's all sort of cause and effect stuff. It doesn't keep track of time. There was a fire, and then this god that was always kind of there, named Tatathius, took the timeless judgment and made another force called the mischievous test. So there's these two things, and they were mingled together to make a stream by this other god that popped up, and then the timeless judgment, and then, they mingled together to make the land. But then Tatathius used the land to make Kogamom the turtle, who laid an egg, and the fairies, these Zolodon fairy things, hatched out of the egg, and they then used the timeless judgment to make the dwarves. That's where they came from. That's how the dwarves understand themselves. Possibly those fairies would still be there, and they could just talk to the people that made them. That's interesting. Or the fairies are gone. Who knows, right? It's like maybe they can talk to Kogamom the turtle, everyone's grandfather or whatever. It's like, grandfather Kogamom the turtle, how you doing? So it's all, there's a lot of possibilities here. But the reason that it chose the timeless judgment for their magic is because of that arrow. It kind of looked back, and this is also how they understand their history. So when it built that paragraph, it just looked up the tree. This is not the entire creation myth. There is a giant creation myth that explains all of the different things that happened in the world, kind of corresponding to the right-hand side of this list, which, if you'll notice at the bottom, has 9 pages. The people understand their part of the world. And if you've got the slider all the way over that says there's no fantasy stuff, it can still generate these and just call it, the myths that people believe, and then just generate another one, and that's the myths that these people believe. It doesn't need to be real. So that's kind of what we're working with there. We have this sort of working with this was kind of brought in, to stark relief what kind of difficulties we were going to have here. We have this cause and effect graph, right? And we probably get into the sort of lives scale of things happening in the creation myths. And then when you go to history generation, you're starting to do years at a time and weeks at a time sometimes in some of the sort of seasonal parts that are required to do like farming properly in history generation. And then when you're actually playing the game, you get into seconds. So there's a sort of dawn of time, right? In the dawn of time, we have this sort of resolution, and we kind of jokingly call the middle part the dawn of space, because you have objects and then they gain spatial relationships in the myth. You know where that stream was. It was the stream there, the Fupithion stream, that flows from the land to the lightless hell, kind of like a Styxy thing or something, right? And so we understand spatial relationships, but we don't have a map of that thing, but we have to come to terms with not having a map of that thing when we actually need that thing, and we put it on a map. So there's this arrow. All these arrows are hard. You have how do you realize the things that are left over after the creation myth in sort of a world generation? That's a problem we haven't even begun to address, but that's kind of one of the main problems of the release after this one. And then you finally get to the play area and playing the game, and people kind of want to restart this, so you play the fortress for a while, and then I want to jump the world forward 1,000 years, right? There's just the resolution of the maps increasing, but this idea of reversing the arrows and going back to the abstract mode, it's like putting the cat back in the bag, basically. When you unabstract things, you are losing data that you may end up wanting to have had. When you want your stories to make sense, especially if the person's like, I want to generate 1,000 years, and then they stop after 5 years, and like, no, I don't want to. And then it's already deleted all this information, and then you have sort of a ghost of the old world sitting around. Just things to think about if you're kind of building up a system. It doesn't need to be complex, like the Dwarf Fortress system, just any kind of story system that's going between modes. Just, keep in mind it's hard to go backwards. So trying to wind up here, let's talk about the last little bit. So this is the hard part that we're still working on. Here's a simple fantasy situation. You just swipe some crap and someone yells at you, halt, or whatever. And I think that was from a Bethesda game. I don't remember. What's actually going on here, though, if you wanted to think about how the guards should react in that situation, there's a lot of things for them to actually think about. In the spirit of simulation, we want to be able to simulate these things. And that's hard. Because you need to come up with a model for how that works. Like, what's your law model? And I've been reading a lot about civil and common law and all kinds of things like that. And yeah, it's and this is part of, I guess, academic and industry collaboration and collaboration with the humanities and so forth. Is getting that kind of thing to work. We have simple type of stuff like this working now, where we have some like a book in world generation that was written to sort of propagate the value of peace, because the person in their head had peace at a higher level, can put that in a book. In world generation, if it goes to a library, we have this kind of cultural influence model that comes from libraries. And libraries are only built by cultures that value knowledge right now, so this would only happen in certain parts of the world. And that would cause that place to become more peaceful, because all of the people that, unless they have certain personality facets, would just tend to be more peaceful. Whereas in the game itself, you can read that book, or a dwarf can read that book, and then either take that knowledge to heart themselves or debate it in a very, very silly mode we have right now, where you can pretty much change anybody's mind. It's like, hey, don't you know peace is cool? And they're like, I never really thought about that before. And you can just go, if you want, you can just kind of change the world, wandering around in adventure mode, teaching everybody about peace, and then the war will stop. So I mean, it's just, we're just starting out trying to figure these things out. But the modeling is hard, right? Here's the kind of, I don't know, it's called IPIP or IPIP, whatever, or NEO-PIR, all these kind of, like, the big five are at the top. This is personality facets. Big five are at the top, 30 facets. This is psychology. I mean, it could be a little bit outdated now, who knows? Well, lots of people know, not me. So for adapting this to a game, though, these psychological systems tend to be non-judgmental, which makes them not good for characters, because you need to judge people a little bit. So we had to, scrape around and modify it, and it's something to keep in mind when you are taking on systems. You feel free to just kind of make them fit, what you need in the game. We had to do quite a bit of work, and of course, anyone wants to talk to me about this stuff afterward, it's cool. And then you end up in this case where you have one person, this guard, say, and you're trying to turn them into a person, so they've got their little player face sticking out of their cog now, and they got to think about all this stuff and somehow turn it into the next thing they do. The only kind of saving grace here is that we're not good at that either. So it's all right if they make mistakes and they just kind of act in character. But it's kind of the difficult challenge, and this is the stuff we're going to tackle after the myth stuff. 5, 6, 7 years, I'd say, which is something I'm allowed to say now since I've been working on it for 15. And hopefully, it's not just another empty statement, and we'll make some actual progress. So that's the talk. So yeah, I guess it's up to the organizers how questions are going to work. Just do questions for a bit. Yeah. So.
I actually have two questions. The first is, so adventure mode and fortress mode are both great, but they're also not quite orthogonal, but they're pretty different.
Mm-hmm.
And implementing one sort of seems to come at the expense of the other or whatever. So you had done a lot of fortress mode. What was the impetus for doing something so totally different? Why did you put in a new mode entirely?
So there's a couple reasons for that. When we started out, the games I showed you mainly, we were mostly interested in RPGs ourselves. And adventure mode's been in from the first release of the game. And it was something we were kind of, and you saw that weird handstand game, right? The game we worked on for kind of 5 years was strictly an RPG, if you want to call it that, if you want to give it that much credit. And so it's just what we were interested in. But Fortress mode is kind of the thing that ended up taking off. But it also gives us a good perspective. I think they both give us, now the way we think about it is that they both give us an excellent perspective on the mechanics. Adventure mode gives us a microscope on the mechanics and lets us see how well they're working locally. And Fortress mode keeps us honest to the society aspects of the game. So it does seem to kind of double the work, but I think it's starting to get to the point now where it's complementing. Not there yet, but I think in the end, hopefully it'll be something that allows you to kind of, the original thing was actually a story idea, right? Where you had it's just kind of Lord of the Rings stuff, right? Where you have the Moria falling, but then there's the Reclaim expedition, right? Which is why we had the reclaim mechanics in the game, where you can send more dwarves back into your old fortress, and then it's there. But there's also sort of the fellowship aspect, right, where you explore a ruin, but it's a ruin that you understand well. So there's kind of this strange context thing going on. We just kind of wanted to see what that did, and of course it ended up being, it's a lot of work, and it is, like you say, kind of they're at odds with each other, and you get some upset fans sometimes that like one over the other. But yeah, that's was that you had another one you said?
The second question is, do you consider yourself good at Dwarf Fortress?
No.
No.
No, I mean, I think that's common with developers, really, because people have more time to play our games than we do, especially once they're out and we're kind of done with them, which I'm not, but that's it's I'm terrible, really. I forget that I have to ask people what things do. There are a few modders on the board that know some of the internal stuff in the game better than I do, so I forget about it. Yeah, I'll get to Go ahead.
In terms of indies, you have. I mean, I would refer to Dwarf Fortress as an independent project, as an indie game. But you have a huge community in terms of modding and sort of an ecosystem around your game that really only parallels exist in terms of like Bethesda or like large studios. What are some of the difficulties of kind of handling that?
Yeah, I run an internet forum, and that's. I mean, just imagine, right? Just imagine everything you know about the internet and having to deal with it, and I know a lot of you do, so, and more than I do. So, that's the main thing. We started the forum in 2001 maybe, and have been running it nonstop for 16 years, and you have to spot what people are doing and nurture the things that are cool. So many things in the game have come out of little community projects, receiving emails from people, read those all the time, I mean, we've got something like how many tens of thousands of suggestions on the board now? We barely can read them all, right? And that gets people frustrated. That's another big problem, is that. And also managing, like, someone with a good-hearted suggestion comes to your board and posts a thread and then get yelled at because it's already been suggested like 13 times, and you have to use the search function but guess the right words and all that kind of thing. And so tensions build over time. But I think because the game it takes a little bit of getting used to, there's sort of a sort of helpfulness that's also in the community, and they help each other a lot. And we've also encouraged that by creating special places where they can do that. We also do a monthly Q&A to kind of help people out. Not to help them play the game, but just to understand where it's going. Other difficulties are just sort of the technical difficulties of running like large file transfers and stuff, especially difficult when bandwidth was more expensive when we were starting out. Like, where do you put saves for people to? We have the whole file depot now. Someone else made that and was paying for it themselves, and then we kind of offered to take it, or they didn't want to run. I don't remember the exact details, but now we're paying for the hosting and stuff. And then there's the whole utilities side, where the game's been basically reverse engineered completely and has been for a while, right? They send me like pictures of the headers with the variable names and stuff, and like, is this right? I'm like, yeah, I was trying to be helpful, but it's a little disconcerting, but so that, yeah, no, and I wouldn't have guessed any of this stuff would have happened in advance. It was kind of yeah.
So you kind of touched on this a little bit during the talk when you were talking about, I think, like the engravings and the players' tendencies to kind of construct narratives in their head based on this things they see. Have you considered, or are you planning to implement more in the way of like arcs with things in the game to construct like a more sort of deliberately satisfying narrative, or are you satisfied with this sort of like one thing after another and just let the players piece it together?
Yeah, so I mean, it'd be something like the sort of drama manager type things and that kind of stuff, or what are those called in like Left 4 Dead? The director type thing. Is that? I mean, that's kind of the same thing, right? As like kind of deciding how the game is going to be. Leaning against it, I don't know. Like, I think things would get too samey, is just kind of the feeling I have. But at the same time, we have a lot of things in the game now, like triggers for when sieges happen, that just as a basic question of fairness and not ruining the game immediately, right? And that is a form of pacing, and I think mainly we're staying away from that, though. We're hoping that it can be carried entirely on the elements alone, and I guess that's just a mixed bag because some people tend to like it and some people don't. So I think they're pretty much sticking with the method we've got now. Oh, I'm doing. Oh, yeah, I'll do the one another. Yeah, sure.
Do you have like a favorite narrative that someone sent you?
Oh, I always have trouble with favorite questions. I mean, I like that one that I did in the talk with the demon and the bridge, but I'm sorry, I can't do favorite questions. I just can't do it. Yeah, and I love Dwarf Fortress stories, but I can never come up with one. So I apologize. Did you have a question, or oh, you're just done? Yeah, switching over. Yeah. Okay.
All right, well, thank you very much. This was awesome.
Hey everyone, it's me, Chaz. While we're changing over for the next panel, I had some announcements of some very exciting and honored guests that we have today that we didn't have yesterday. First of all, over here in the green carpet area, we have video games. Yeah, brought to you by BitBash, the Midwest's premier video games festival. What games could you play? You can play Sausage Sports Club. You can play Tumbleseed. And you can play That Bloomin' Feelin', all handcrafted in Chicago, Illinois, Video Game City, USA. So thank you, Bryce Pulse, for setting up BitBash and bringing BitBash to us today. And any other BitBash staff, Jamie Sanchez. Shout out to all BitBash staff who's here. So yeah, it's there for you to enjoy during our breaks or whenever you just like really need to play around with floppy sausage animals. Also, with us today, representatives from Video Game Art Gallery. Yeah. Back there, Video Game Art Gallery staff, Mick Reed, Tom Caprell, and Kay Slater are here. Raise your hands. There you go. And if you have any questions about VGA, how we do fine art prints with video games, please talk to them. Check out the art that's back there. Also, in the maker space, which is the next big room that's not this big room, we have Elizabeth Hunter and Company's Something Wicked, the video game about Macbeth, which you can play today as well. So I'm really, really happy. Thank you for filling out our offerings here at the conference. And Pride VR is also there in the makerspace. So please check out Pride VR as well. Okay. And and if you want to participate in the Game Jam, sign up on the Itch page. And more about that later. Bye.
You just spoke, so you get to decide whether you would rather go first, because you're like in the zone,
Normally,
or
I just rather keep it hooked up, yeah, because it's falling apart, and I don't like messing with the connection very much. So.
awesome. Okay, so do you have preferences about speaker order particularly?
I do not care. Whatever works.
Since I'm sitting last time.
Okay. Well, so, I mean, I don't have panel questions or anything like that. I just thought we would talk and then people can ask us questions. And
completely
I
fine.
think there
Yeah.
will be questions.
So do you want to just go?
I guess we might as well, yeah.
That seems simple.
Maybe give people just a couple of minutes to pee.
Need to make sure that I can actually do a YouTube connection here. I'm gonna try the video during the talk. Let's see how well that works.
Yeah, I've got a couple of audio clips which may or may not play. We'll see.
that's good or bad. But I mean, you should give it a shot. Have you tried it before?
I have watched Ethan curate it, and that intimidated me. But now I actually really want to try it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the adventure mode's pretty much not worth playing unless you just want to, watch an animal gore you to death or wander through a town and not know what's going on. But
Well, I think I hadn't understood the whole failure is fun thing, and like that actually kind of changes it for me. It's like, okay, I'm not trying to win. I'm just
What
going
is
to
the
see what
explosion
happens.
gonna look like?
Yeah, right.
yeah, I mean, how interesting, it's like we were saying, there's kind of the ideal version and then what we actually have, because, how fun is it to have a ruin in your world depends on how you can interact with it.
Yeah.
And right now you could just kind of go back and just have 7 dwarves there again, and whatever happened is still there. And that can be more or less challenging depending on what happened
Right,
previously.
yeah.
And you can also just kind of wander around there with an adventure, which is more meaningful in the release that's going to be in a couple months, because you can like recover books or objects and then bring them to people that care about them. And so there's like a meaningful story arc there. But right now you can just kind of explore.
Yeah.
And if you have a grudge or something, you can kind of sort it out. But so it's only marginally interesting.
I think we should bring people back. Okay, please come in and sit down. We're going to start the AI panel now. And our first speaker will be Tarn Adams, because he's already set up at the podium.
Okay. Yeah. So this is more. This is just a little AI thing. Nothing super cutting edge or anything. And you can see we got my pictures back. So I just wanted to talk about in the next release of the game, sort of what it means to be carrying an object that somebody cares about. That's because it's kind of, we have a lot more with that in the next version. So here we are, say, bringing a scepter someplace. That's a scepter, or a little Lego torch or whatever, I don't know. And so the first thing that happens is people, like townspeople that you're walking by, they can now understand, if they recognize that object, that it's important and that you have it. That can either form a rumor in their head that's kind of waiting to be placed into kind of the local culture's rumor pool, which gets kind of a delay on it and then can kind of pass from town to town when people visit taverns and so forth. Or people can talk openly on the street about, hey, isn't that the scepter that we've been missing for 200 years, that person is just carrying, walking through town holding. And so now they can also be, say, either criminals or other people that were out on the quest to return the scepter. And they see you with the scepter, and what they think is, I want the scepter, right? This is something that we kind of handled by going to self-defense sites and looking up mugging, like how did so this is when they formed intent. Now they formed intent to retrieve this object, and then they do what's called the positioning for the attack here. Their goal is not to get into a fight with you, but to simply overwhelm you and take what's yours. So here they're positioning for it. And now the thing is, in video games especially, people are attuned to this kind of like, here's a mob of people coming toward me, and they're all called like human mercenary or something, right? So it's like, okay, you want to be on the lookout. So we already have a thing in the game, it's been in there for a while, where people just talk to you on the street. It's in a lot of games. You're just like, hi, how's it going? And they can talk about, oh, did you know that there's a cave troll over in the hills that you can fight with or something? So they'll do the same thing now. This guy will walk up to you and just be like, hey, did you know there's a cave troll over in the hills? And you'll be like, you'll go into the sort of, it's important to have non-modal dialogue here, where it's not just like a big pop-up that has menus that you interact with, but the action continues as you're speaking and get words at the bottom of the screen. So you'll be having this engaging dialogue with this mercenary that you think is now a mercenary hunting a cave troll. The person comes up and talks to you, and then they drop it. They don't care anymore, and they're like, give me the scepter. And the people are in position, and it's less likely that you would have noticed. I don't know how victimized the player feels by this, but this is how they operate. Now, if you're actually facing the sort of civilian guards or the people that are in charge of the museum or the rulers, guards that would be interested in the scepter, they think about it. They form this kind of encounter in their mind where they say, okay, we want the scepter, but it's legitimately great that someone brought it back to us, and plus this is kind of an adventure game, and while we're treating it like one, we're supposed to be happy and like give them quest rewards and stuff, right? I mean, there's this whole thing going on, and they're like, hey, you got the scepter, that's great. And they act like it's increased your reputation, but it hasn't done so yet. They just are in this happy mode where they try and direct you toward where the scepter is actually supposed to go. And they think of the sort of radius and distance away from the place where it's supposed to go. And they'll start following you. They don't quite position themselves for a mugging, but they'll follow you and see, is the scepter leaving the bounds? And if it gets a little too far, then they switch into not an attack mode, but into a demand mode. They're like, no, give us the scepter. It's not leaving this town again for another couple hundred years. And now you can try and fool them a little bit. We have thought of a few ways that people can do things. If you throw an object, or if you hide an object in a backpack, we had trouble with the guy going like, oh, okay, and then walk away like when does object permanence come to a child, right? This is the sort of thing. So we had to give them object permanence. Now they ask you, where is it? Or they'll be watching for throws, and then they just go over and pick it up and ignore you. So that was, now, the other thing is when you finally get the scepter and you bring it back to the podium, or whatever that is, and put it on their pedestal, and you want to get your reputation, right? You're like, I want my 100 gold pieces. I want my plus 25 treasure hunter, or whatever. That doesn't happen. You put it on the podium, they'll be happy it's back, but they won't know you put it there unless they see you. And someone remarks on it. Reputation in our game right now is stored as events. And the events have, whatever identity you were under, whatever affiliation you had, so that they can think of you in that way, and they can sort of dynamically change their thoughts about you if one of those affiliations becomes tagged a certain way. Like if they suddenly start a war with that affiliation, then what they know about you is all these great things, but you're also potentially aligned with somebody that they're now at war with. So they kind of keep this information. But you do basically, want to be known as the person that returned the treasure, so we allow a kind of behold action. And anyone that you're talking to or in the area, when because what I've said so far makes it sound like you want to kind of keep the thing hidden for a while, right? Because someone might see you with it. But someone eventually, you want them to see you with it, so you can put it on the pedestal, be known as the person that brought it back. And it's possible to game this system as well if you adopt a new identity, which is another new mechanic in the upcoming release, where if you're saying, oh, I'm from the third place, and I'm bringing the scepter back, then that, due to the fact that these artifacts can have multiple claims on them, family claims, religious claims, sort of civilization level claims, that you could start some trouble if you want by assuming a different identity. Now, if they already know who you are because they know your face, etc., there's this whole other part I didn't go into about the muggers might not attack you if they know who you are and you have a reputation already as someone that you wouldn't want to surround. So there's quite a few things going into that, but I thought I'd just talk about that. So there we go. That's my whole thing. All right.
Okay, I'm going to give a kind of a micro postmortem on MK Ultra, which is a game that I would consider a failure, but a failure I'm very happy to have made. So the basic idea is in my research community in game AI research, we tend to sort of take for granted that, in the future there will be all these great technologies that are driving characters, but we keep not making them. And so one of the impetuses for doing this was just, okay, let's just make the stupid stuff. Let's make a bunch of autonomous characters that have all the things you learn about in undergraduate AI class, except machine learning, and see if we can make a game out of that. And so the concept of the game the conceit of it is that the CIA mind control experiments actually worked. And so your player character, A, is autonomous, but B, can go up to any NPC and inject false beliefs into their heads. And so you get puzzle gameplay by trying to manipulate the characters, but you're not joysticking them, you're making them believe false shit so that they will do the things you want. And one of the reasons that's nice is that AI technology tends to be kind of fragile, and it's a way of sort of sneakily turning debugging your AI into gameplay. So if they do something crazy while they're under my AI, then my AI is bad. But if they do something crazy while you're mind controlling them, well, of course they're mind controlled zombies. That makes sense. All right. Happy to talk afterwards with people who are curious about the tech. But basically, there's a natural language parser generator with compositional semantics. So all of the stuff that like AI promises will do. A planning system, a reasoning system with something of an ontology, and then some more esoteric stuff like reasoning about, should I lie to this person? If I tell them the truth, will that disclose something that I don't want them to know? Blah 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 blah. Under what conditions is it okay to steal someone's stuff or to kill them? Things like that. And then the big issue with it is the user interface. So you have basically free text natural language interaction. What you type is the interior thoughts of your character, unless they're in conversation with someone else, in which case it's what you want your character to say. And so there's a lot of questions about how to surface the system to the player so they aren't just completely confused about what's going on, what's available to them, and so on. And the main, and basically that's where things are really problematic in the system. We tried to do a bunch of stuff with auto completion and so on, but there are issues with it. So let's do it. That did not work. There we go. All right. So basically thank you. So basically what it is in the current state is it's a tech demo. You are Betsy here, who's visiting her friend Kavi. They're both secret agents. They can't acknowledge that's what's going on. The characters are totally autonomous, so they're just sitting around talking to one another. And as Betsy, you know that Kavi has stolen your MacGuffin. But you can't admit that you know that. And so you need to go to Betsy's house to steal your MacGuffin back. You need to go to Kavi's house to steal your MacGuffin back. And so you can do things, and Kavi just said to stay out of the bedroom. So you can say, search the bedroom. And as you type, it's doing sort of randomized auto completions to show you possible things you could type. You find it, yay. But unfortunately now, Kavi comes in and eats you, because I was doing this with public domain assets and I didn't have any tile animations for holding a gun or anything like that. So if you want to actually win the game, what you have to do is to inject false beliefs into Kavi's head so that Kavi won't kill you. And so I'll just give you one example. And Kavi's about to walk away. Okay. Talk to Kavi. It's research software. Okay, and they chat, but now I can say, believe you are an orange. And now I can say, believe you are hungry. And Kavi will eat himself. All right, so that is MK Ultra. So, let me. So the thing that's fun about it is, it's kind of sandboxy. There are a lot of different ways you can, solve puzzles like that. You can tell Kavi to believe that you're someplace else, even though Kavi's having a conversation with you. You can kill Kavi. You can lock Kavi in the refrigerator. You can simply tell him that you're a member of the Illuminati too. He'll believe it, and then you can just say, "Okay, get me the MacGuffin," and Kavi will bring you the MacGuffin. And there's a bunch of stuff that I wanted to do with it. Like, there's a lot of possibilities for a mechanic like that. So any communication device then becomes an area effect weapon. Earplugs become armor. And you can have like weapons of mass delusion. So you can have the Scientology bomb that just broadcasts recruiting messages to anyone in the area. You can have the Grateful Dead groupie bomb that is just a non-lethal pacification device that just makes everybody mellow. Or you could have an actual puzzle of you have some obelisk that when anyone gets near it, they want to commit suicide. So like, how do you get around that? Do you like put in the earplugs or whatever? Okay. What went right is that it's a really cool tech demo. I learned a whole lot of neat stuff in the process of building it, and a lot of that stuff has ended up getting used in other games, including stuff I talked about earlier. What went wrong is the standard problem you always have with this kind of AI stuff. That we're still working on how to solve, which is that the natural language interface sets up a bunch of expectations for the system actually understanding unrestricted natural language. It doesn't. It understands particular lexicon, a particular grammar, particular rules about how the world works, and you have to have some way of figuring out which of those things, you as the player have to have some way of figuring out which of those things it's going to understand and which of it doesn't. I'd hoped that the auto-completion stuff where you get very quick feedback when you're saying something it doesn't understand would be enough. And empirically, it just isn't. So that makes it frustrating for people to play. And so basically, it ends up being a game that's very cool to watch me play, much less cool for you to play yourself. And so I'm probably going to come back to this at some point in the future, but what I'll do then is basically take the tech, throw away most of the game, and make something that's much more like, here's a level with a very constrained problem to solve. Here's another level with a very constrained problem to solve, teaching you like one verb at a time, all the standard level design stuff that you do in traditional game design, and not try and do that at the same time that we have an open-ended narrative about mysteries and you're interviewing people and stuff like that. Okay, thanks.
Cool. That's an excellent setup for me, in fact. Right, okay, so all of the things that we just heard are impossible to do are, in fact, what I'm currently working on. So So I work at Spirit AI, which is a company that's doing middleware, working on modeling conversation. We have a product called Character Engine, for which I'm the product manager, and it's looking at how can we track narratively what's going on in a character interaction, how can we track emotional state and knowledge state with that character, and then allow games to plug into that in one of a couple of different ways. So the less ambitious, more kind of we can do this more immediately way is to generate dialogue interactions and menu items at runtime based on kind of what the system currently knows about what's going on and the plot that you've developed so far. I talked about this a little bit yesterday. The more ambitious version is to actually accept natural language input and look at that using a series of classifiers and entity recognition. So the classifiers are looking for kinds of intent like, are you asking a question? Are you making a social move of some kind? And this is similar to the methodologies that are used for things like Siri and Alexa, but applying some of the similar kinds of methods to something that is much more narratively constrained, meaning that you can have moments where characters asked a question and therefore we have reasonable expectations about what kinds of things would be sensible to say next. And we can also develop expectations around sort of general, simple types of question that should always be understood and that the system should always be able to respond to, combined with some tooling that allows on a per game basis for the developer to create new classifiers and new ways of looking for particular things in the player input, and then iterate a lot with kind of incoming sample player data in order to improve the robustness of its understanding. And all of that plugs into dialogue with the character where the character's responses are also using text generation to respond to you. So again, I mentioned this, this demo a little bit yesterday of you are interrogating this robot about a situation where there's been a murder, they were around, they saw some of the things that happened around the murder, but they don't actually know precisely what happened. So you're asking them questions to try and find out who might have done it, under what circumstances, and you're actually needing to lead the robot to understand the situation a little bit differently than it does initially. So spoiler, the robot has the wrong idea about the time of death, and you can kind of get to that fact and have her readjust what her knowledge is about the situation, and then once you've done that, she's able to kind of suggest some different conclusions about what really happened. But she's also a suspect in this situation. She's been brought in by the local police who have a lot of prejudices against robots and don't seem to appreciate how good and pure and innocent robots are. And so she's also got this kind of compulsion to check in with you about, like, are you going to defend me or not? So this is something that's kind of set up in the authorship for the robots to kind of ask you these questions. And so this is an example of her inquiring about kind of what you think about her guilt state. And I'll go into kind of how it's constructing that a little bit more in a minute, but she's kind of putting you on the spot to respond to her. There are a lot of pieces of this that are coming from our own internal technology, and then there are also several things where we're tying into or connecting what we're doing with other exciting AI advances that are going on right now. So I'm going to quickly talk about a couple of the external pieces of technological development that tie into what we're trying to accomplish, and then a little bit more about what we're doing internally. So one of the really obvious applications for the more ambitious version of this technology is as a VR experience, because a VR, or for that matter, an AR experience, it becomes much more awkward to have a sort of standard dialogue tree that seems weird, feels weird. It also feels weird to be in a VR space with a character that you can't interact with in any way. And VR also gives you a sense of immersion and presence and connection with the characters in that space that you don't really get in a console game. So we actually made a version of this demo. It was very simplistic early on in the process in a VR space. and her, like, she physically was quite small, and she was sitting on a little chair, and she could respond to how close you were standing to her, so she would feel menaced if you were kind of looming over her. And it really introduced this interesting additional dynamic into the relationship with her. So that kind of presence and intensity of a VR experience, even if it's quite compressed and short, you get something out of sharing a physical space with a character, and much higher expectations, but also much higher payoff in terms of the emotional communication that you can have with that character. So some of the other things that are going on right now that are kind of interesting to imagine bringing into this are things like recognizing emotions from facial expressions. So if you think about what's possible in VR, you've got a camera on the player. You can look at their gestures. You can look at their face. You can listen to their audio input and not only extract from natural language, like here are the markers that I'm detecting from their actual spoken words, but also here are the things that I'm picking up about their emotionality from the audio. So there's a lot of sort of interesting challenges around this. This is a picture of two other people from my company, Shasha and Mitsu, at a demonstration of Affectiva, which is one of these emotional recognition technologies. And apparently, Affectiva thinks that Shasha is disgusted by what she's seeing, which is not what I would read from her expression. But so they're kind of like issues about how confident can we be about these things. But that technology is moving forward extremely quickly. And one of the interesting things about it is that the more different channels that you have for reading the player's input, the more you can arrive at confidence around some aspect of it. So if you have multiple channels that you're looking at of their face, their voice, the exact text of their utterance, their stance, all of these kinds of things, you might not be able to derive with certainty an understanding of any one aspect, but if you're looking at that whole collection, there might be a combination of indicators or one single classifier that is giving you quite a lot of confidence in what they're doing. So that gives you a lot of scope for reacting to emotional input. I think that takes you in some really interesting directions from a game design perspective, which we've sort of only partially understood, and I think it's only as we actually get into designing around that kind of experience that we'll even see what some of the challenges are. So on the plus side, I imagine experiences where you can really kind of get into role play with a character, have this kind of like, all right, I'm going to kind of sample improv being really angry at you and see what happens. And that can be a very fun and sort of physically immersive thing. We know that the expressions that we make on our faces, even if we're just acting, can actually affect the mood that we're genuinely feeling. So there's kind of an interesting interplay there. The downside would be if it became kind of this tiring emotional labor, right? Like if you've got an NPC that always wants to see you smiling, and you kind of have to constantly smile even if you're not really feeling like that. I mean, it becomes like having a horrible service industry job, and that would not be an enjoyable gameplay experience. So I think there are a lot of interesting design spaces that takes us into that we need to be thoughtful about, but also just some potential for a kind of role-playing improv experience that has just not really been seen in games before. Another really interesting piece of what's going on is the incredibly rapid progress recently in voice synthesis. And now I have to see whether this is actually going to play.
Emily short voice created by Laravel from roughly 70 sentences of recorded data pen.
Right. Okay, so it only sort of wanted to play at the end there, but what that is a version of my voice, which I personally think only sort of sounds like me because it's a little bit sort of flat and low affect. But the interesting thing about that was that it was produced, I made it in my hotel room last night by talking to my computer for a few minutes. I read aloud about 70 lines, and it was able to put that together. And that's an incredible kind of speed advance over where we've been recently. So the robot demo, we are using a voice from Cereproc, which is a bit older technology. It's got a sort of Scottish voice, which is an interesting choice for a robot, but maybe she was built in Edinburgh. But the challenge there is that some of those older technological solutions really require a huge amount of training data to get anywhere interesting, and that creates kind of cost barriers to building those kinds of things, especially if you've got a big game with lots of voices that you're trying to synthesize. But you really need something like that in order to be able to make full use of what is going on in the text generation, because a lot of what the underlying system is doing is actually constructing this textual output on the fly. So we've actually, in the authoring tool, we've got the ability to kind of mark things up as here are how lines relate to each other, here are how things are dependent on each other, and also here are variants of what text we can speak. This particular example is actually kind of where that line of, well, do you think I'm guilty, comes from. What's happened is we've reached a certain point in the story where we've triggered a new scene where she's going to ask us this question. It's actually a very short scene because we're just kind of focusing on that one concern. And then if you actually kind of open up in the authoring tool and look at what it's doing there, she's got several different variant versions of that utterance that she can make depending on how she's feeling. We've seen that she's substituted in, my friend as the way of addressing you, because apparently at that point in the story you've had a good relationship so far. And then we've also put a little bit of a stutter on it because she's feeling anxious and awkward. So there's a level of speech disfluency that comes in at the end to kind of sell her emotional state. And all of that is stuff where you couldn't get all of that complexity and then actually have a voice actor record all of the versions. So we really need that kind of generated speech to work with. But the sort of state of the art and how quickly you can generate things and how well you can generate them has moved enormously just in the last 12 months. And I think we're going to get to some things that sound less robotic than the sample of my voice that we heard earlier, but with this sort of similar rapidity of training in the near future. Am I out of time, or? I have one other thought, but I can skip it.
Have your one other thought.
Okay. The final point is about the question of supporting the actual gameplay well through the emotional and social modeling that we're doing. So my last highly procedural project, Versu, we had social models where the characters could go and do various things to one another. But it was difficult to keep that simulation under the control of the narrative, and it was kind of this struggle that Tarn was alluding to, at which we were not always succeeding. So we experimented with drama management, we experimented with putting narrative rules around individual scenes to limit what the simulation could achieve, but there was always this uneasy relationship between the simulation and the story. So what we're bringing in from having learned that is thinking in terms of the social moves that are going to be good building blocks of gameplay, rather than just kind of simply, here's what we imagine somebody could hypothetically do, and then let's try and cram it into a story. Instead, think about, like, a social action is going to affect long and short-term state. It's going to affect the character's propensity to do certain kinds of things. And if we make the authoring structured that way, and we also make the system able to reason about what's going to bring us towards an interesting narrative moment, that combination of things hopefully gets us to something where the simulation is not kicking out so many possibilities that are just kind of at odds with the story that we're interested in telling. So.
Thank you.
All right, cool. So my name is Rob Zubek. You've probably seen me before. I'm a co-founder of a company, SomaSim, and we make simulation strategy games. Our last game was called Project High Rise. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in one moment. I'm glad that I'm going last because we have a kind of an interesting contrasting problem in our game, which is that we had a game where your hero of the game is a building populated by a lot of people, right? Like hundreds, thousands of people. So you have an AI problem where you're dealing with an ecosystem full of agents that are themselves probably fairly simple, right? Or maybe not, right? That was the decision that we had to make. But it's really the player's interaction with the entire ecosystem that was gonna be the fun of the game. So we had a slightly different problem, and I'm gonna tell you a little bit about what we learned from the experience of developing this and sort of making it into a game. And I struggled a little bit with how to title this talk because it's kind of all over the place, but I think this works. So yeah, so let's talk about AI for ants, as it were, and the similarity with an ant farm will be uncanny, as you will see in one moment. Let's see if this video plays. I'm gonna do just show you the, while I talk about the game, I'm gonna show you our trailer video, just because it sort of shows a lot about what the game is about. And I'm not sure that it's gonna work.
Maybe if you click it on the other screen.
Possibly. Of course, that worked. All right, so the game is a skyscraper simulator. So you build and manage high-rise buildings, skyscrapers. You start out small, start out with maybe a little bit of, like a low-rise, something like that, maybe a shopping mall. As you get some tenants, they will start paying you money. As you get money, you can build out better and better kinds of buildings, get better tenants that pay you more rent so that you can build larger, so that you can make more money, and so on. It's your typical sort of tycoon management economics game, kind of a game. And the idea is that you want to sort of, in order to progress in the game, you have to make better and fancier kind of buildings, which means you have to get better and better tenants, which means, so for example, maybe you want to get, the business headquarters of a major company, or maybe a fancy law office because they're going to pay you a lot in rent, which would be perfect, except they're going to have a lot of demands, right? The fancy law office is going to require great restaurants so that they can have their business meetings in. They're going to require maybe a laundry service on site, or maybe stores, or maybe something else. And those restaurants are themselves going to require infrastructure, and everybody requires something else, right? So you end up with this ecosystem where a lot of things depend on each other, and you're supposed to sort of make it all work and still make money. And that's the challenging part. So yeah, that's good. So the challenge here is that it's a challenge of scale, of AI scale. What I mean by this is probably best illustrated by a great article that this journalist from The Guardian wrote about us. So he is a guy who writes about city and urban issues, gentrification, and so on. He played the game for several weeks and wrote this article about his experience playing it. It was fascinating because he sort of talks about his experience playing it as if it was a representation of a real thing. So at first, when he's a landlord, right, he writes that he started building, a small building, and he really cared about the tenants, right? He got to know them. He named them. He knew all about their sort of what they wanted and what they didn't want. But the problem is he needed to move up and up, build larger and larger. And by the time he got, to 6, 7 floors or larger, he didn't care about them anymore, right? They became a burden. He objectified them. He only saw them as source of revenue, which is an interesting issue because this was entirely planned, right? The issue is that when you have a building that's enormous, that has hundreds, that has thousands of residents, you're not going to be able to keep track of all of them, right? This is something that we knew would happen, that you're going to be faced with this issue of you have a lot of different characters that you need to deal with. You're not going to be able to track all of them. And also, you still need some kind of, the building still needs to work as an ecosystem. It still needs to be full of different elements that all work together. So when we're planning out what kind of AI to implement for the characters, it was sort of a process of discovery because we didn't arrive at the perfect solution immediately. We sort of got there iteratively. We started by considering Sims AI. Like, maybe the characters want to be like The Sims. And this was a convenient choice because I had worked on the Sims franchise before. So I sort of, it was a familiar choice. But we discounted it fairly quickly The reason for this, so if you don't know the Sims AI, it's based on sort of like a Maslow hierarchy of needs kind of stuff, where you have your physiological needs like hunger, energy, and then once those are satisfied, you have your higher level needs, the social need to interact with other people, need for fun, and things like that, being in a great environment kind of stuff. The downside of this was that the Sims AI has been historically tricky to tune. By tuning, I mean making it behave in a way that's predictable and where you know how it's going to behave. I think, all right, I'll let these guys take care of that. We'll still keep talking. So basically, it was difficult to tune for a game where the player interacts with 5 characters, with 10 characters, because in order to play The Sims, you have to really pay attention to them and pay attention to their needs. If you have 500 characters, if you have 1,000 characters, that's not doable, right? The second thing we considered was, all right, so what if we pull this one level up and consider only in terms of goals and plans? Like, give somebody a goal to, like, go do a business lunch, right? And they should figure out by themselves how to get there. It's the classic AI planning approach. And we kind of got a little bit further in that direction. Initially considered a predicate logic planner, and actually implemented a propositional planner, which was kind of interesting. Just because performance, right? Like for propositional planner, you can encode it as, but anyway. So the difficulty we ran into was getting a variety of flavor out of this, right? Because what we learned in the process of implementing this was that we needed a lot of flavor to express the variety of different tenants. So for example, maybe you have some small offices that you rent out to insurance agents or accountants or something like that, and they're your 9 to 5 people, and they come in the morning, they have their lunch, they leave at 5, kind of stuff. And then you have those lawyers that we talked about a moment ago, who maybe work until 10 p.m., but they're gonna want a lot of stuff, and they're gonna come to work a little bit later, and they're going to employ a lot of people with them. And between those two extremes, maybe you have a lot of different other things. Maybe you have students who live in little apartments and they, go out in and out at different parts of the day, or maybe you have retirees who hang out at home, in the evening, but maybe go shopping at noon or something like that. You have people who go to work, and anyway, ton of flavor, hundreds of different variants of people's behaviors. And that was kind of difficult with planning, right? Because with a plan, you give them goals and you kind of hope they arrive at the appropriate solution to get there. So what we actually went back to was to represent those kinds of flavors directly, right? Like if we learned that, all right, if we want to have people's daily routines have a very specific representation, let's just represent them in code or in scripts as such. So you sort of went back to sort of like Shankian scripts kind of technology, which was great 1970s, 1980s AI. And even there, like, we didn't go full into it, right? Because there's a lot of very interesting stuff that lives with that conceptual dependency and sort of like mental models and all that. All we stuck with was representing routines, representing sequences of behavior, things, how people behave in everyday life situations as first-class objects. And that was actually a huge win because those represented scripts were very easy to modify. You could have a ton of different variants for, all right, these are your lawyers, these are your insurance agents, these are your students, these are your retirees, and so on. So that was a huge win. So to bring this to a closure, basically we learned 2 interesting lessons about AI for ants by building this game. One was that the detailed representation of the characters, the utility of that was inversely proportional with the number of characters that you end up having, right? If you have a few characters, it's reasonable for the player to inspect them and to keep track of their mental state and so on. If you have 1,000 characters, nobody's gonna care. And then the second part was, as I mentioned before, it was very useful to realize that what we wanted to do is author specific daily routines, and we made those into first-class representations, and that was the authoring level at which we worked. Planning or something like that would give us a lot of flexibility, a lot of interesting things, but it was very difficult to get the right kinds of behaviors from working on a level of abstraction 1 layer or 2 layers too low. So 2 lessons on our end, and that's the AI for Ants. Thank you very much.
Okay, while lunch is getting set up, questions? Ethan.
Okay, so first of all, we want to know how many times you're going to do that Kelta talk. Because you see it like 15 times. So, like a legitimate question, this kind of goes for everybody, is as you're throwing in new AI technologies, devs, like learning Prolog from Keltra or learning the necessary NLP to understand anything that Spirit AI is doing, or really any of that, like there starts to be a learning curve for the people programming the games, not just people playing the games. So, like, how do we address the fact that you might need, 3 years of grad school just to understand the technology you want to throw into the game you want to be done with in like a year and a half? Like, how do we get around that problem?
Well, at least for us, because we know that we don't have the luxury of doing that to our studios that might be using this, a lot goes into the authoring tool as well. So that's something I didn't really have time to get into, but one of the things that we're trying to deal with is allow the author to type kind of example lines of the kinds of things that they would like to be able to recognize in player input, and then we automatically run our classifiers and entity recognition the same way that we would at runtime and say, here's the markup that we got off of that, is that right? And so those kinds of things, like the intention is not that you need to deeply understand how the classifier works, or even that you need to master the list of classifiers being used in your particular game in order to make use of it. So there are kind of things where the better you understand it, the more sort of interesting quirks you could hand roll for it, but the baseline application ought to be accessible to people who don't have that level of knowledge.
That sounds great. I mean, I think that's, on the research side, that's a huge issue. I think of my end goal as being to try and build technologies that could be used by radio, TV, film students, and the intermediate stage is, can I teach an undergraduate computer science class with this and have students have any hope of doing anything with it without having to go offline and learn lots of Prolog? And unfortunately, so far the answer has been no. But yeah.
So it's been really fascinating seeing the different approaches you're all taking for modeling this very detailed stuff. I noticed you're most of you are focusing on a sort of linguistic representation of things. Have you given any thought to, and maybe this is like way too premature to even think about, but localization to systems like that?
Yes. But it's not a completely solved problem, and I mean, yeah. So there are some things that we can do in terms of leveraging machine learning again on the understanding end. There are also some things that we can do in terms of so at least for us, we're interested in not only localization of language, which as you imagine is an issue, but also localization of cultural inputs. So a very simple example of that is that in the sort of reading emotions from faces research, researchers have found that different cultures have different degrees of facial expressiveness, and something that you've tuned for a Greek person might not work on a Scandinavian person. So there's that kind of thing. There's also the localization of expectations about what politeness and rudeness look like. And all of those are things where trying to author all of that by hand is an overwhelming problem. The challenge is to come up with the right abstractions and then the machine learning methodology, and then harvest a huge amount of data. And that actually is one of the biggest challenges, especially when you go to localize towards smaller language communities. Those data sources tend not to be as available. But that's kind of where the challenges are.
And we don't really do much language in our game, although I'm sort of starting to look at natural language generation for a future project, and also I did natural language AI for my dissertation. And yeah, I mean, natural language generation across multiple languages is by far not a solved problem, right? It's just it's a huge can of worms, and I'm afraid to get anywhere near it.
I did look into it. I spent a lot of fun hours learning about Proto-Indo-European, but trying to extend the parser, trying to make a parser that can handle not just Indo-European languages, but also Semitic languages and Chinese, and that was beyond my ability to do on my sabbatical.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. We almost all of the utterances in our game are kind of built up from little pieces, and of course the code for that just relies on English grammar for me. And it's possible to get certain parts of that out, especially interface elements and stuff, to do that kind of localization, and people have kind of hacked the game so that it does that. But I mean, kind of the interesting question for me was how much I could get away with in terms of when we do language generation. And by language generation, I mean in our case that would be generating languages that don't exist, but also having those be translatable just to English is a hard problem. But the initial, I mean, the base representation is hopefully something that other languages will be able to do something with, even though there's going to be probably English biases in there. You know, I've been looking at linguistics for a number of years, and hopefully I can catch certain things so that it's not completely English-based. And then hopefully that will mean that we can localize other parts of the game. But it's just beginning stages for us.
For Emily, I was wondering if, say you're like writing a character you're talking to who's like, so you're speaking in English, but that character has English as a second language. Is that something that a designer, is that something that like Spirit AI's technology or some technology would kind of handle or allow you to edit, or is that something more that the designer would need to kind of like change what sorts of things that character understands? Sorry, this is kind of a big question, but I was wondering if you thought about like, or if there's like research relating to kind of.
So let me clarify the question a little bit. So the question is about portraying the character as somebody who has English as a second language, and is the portrayal you're interested in limiting their understanding of input, or is it about their output?
It's kind of like limiting both. Like, is there? I was kind of like curious how you would think about. I guess how do you represent those sorts of things in a system, or is that? And it's not a priority, but like.
So there isn't currently an abstraction to sort of directly modify somebody's linguistic comprehension level, but the character comprehension tends to come from their, like, what classifiers they have turned on, because that affects kind of like how many pieces of information can they extract from what you're saying to them. So you could imagine something where you've actually turned off some of the classifiers, which that's easy to do in the authoring tool. You could just like turn off all of the things that have to do with detecting certain kinds of cultural nuance, right? Like make a character that just is totally not able to tell whether you're being polite or not, right? So that would be something that as a developer you could sort of selectively omit those classifiers, and then the character would just not have those hooks. And similarly on the output end, you could, you know, edit what the dialogue that you're writing for them to express the kind of level that they're at. There's a stage kind of beyond that we've talked about a bit, but is not really in place, about after text has been generated, being able to do some additional inspection on that generated text and determine oh, this one is too verbose, so I'm going to throw that out because this character doesn't have that verbosity level, and those kinds of things. So you could imagine a method like that being applied to create the effect you were talking about as well.
So, yes. So right. So with regard to Dunbar number, definitely. I mean, I think for a game, the game version of a Dunbar number is much smaller than 250, right? It's like if you go beyond, 10, 20 characters, it's just like, well, there might just as well be 1,000. I don't care anymore. I mean, this will depend on people, I would imagine. Right. So it's interesting, the idea of like letting the characters modify their environment and then have other characters pick up on that modification and adjust their behavior. And this gives sort of the entire ecosystem a certain level of emergent behavior that does not exist in the individual decision making. That's definitely very, very useful. I'm struggling to remember if we did anything quite like that in the game. I mean, there is some elements of characters modifying their environment, especially with things like certain tenants, certain businesses will affect the environmental, so things like smells, noise, dirtiness, and so on will affect the environment, which will affect other people who will not want to move into that area, for example, or they will want to move out. And they will also trigger other characters to maybe go and clean it up because it's there's trash left over by previous tenants. These guys are paid to work on trash, so they're gonna go and clean it up, and now it becomes better again, and now you can move somebody else and so on. We don't do nearly as much as we could with something like this, but yes, I love those kinds of elements. And The Sims specifically use that with very great effect, like the idea that a lot of the behavior of the Sims is a combination of what they want to do from their needs and their traits, and also what's available in the environment. So if a Sim is hungry but there's no fridge, they're just going to starve to death. But the moment they put in the fridge, they realize, oh wait, there's something here that advertises that is going to fulfill my hunger. I'm going to go and interact with that. But unfortunately, in this game, we didn't do nearly as much as we could have with this. But yes, that's a great approach.
We can keep asking questions, but those of you who are looking longingly at the subway should feel free to go and help yourselves.
Including panelists?
Yes, I think so. Yes.
So there's a certain trope or certain expectation as far as certain kinds of game AI. Game AI goes, particularly in regards to things like Bethesda games, where you'll walk into a place and an NPC will approach you, say something completely inane and random, and then walk away. And that's sort of the only real way that some of these games have as far as getting their AI to drop breadcrumbs for the player. And usually when you're not really thinking about it, you sort of just pass it by because we're so used to it now. But when you're trying to build a more realistic or more human AI, that's not very human behavior. So is there sort of a line that you get to where your AI becomes more humanistic but not interesting? And if so, how do you balance the human element and the breadcrumb dropping / interesting to interact with?
Okay. Nobody else is leaping on this. So we ran into an interesting sort of situation with that on Versu, which was specifically on sort of the challenge of more realistic behavior versus versus what people actually want to interact with, which was that we were trying to model the social practices of conversation as accurately as we could. And one of the things that, we had all of these sort of rules about who characters will respond to and turn taking in speech and staying on topic and all of that kind of stuff. And one of the things that we modeled was the idea that people are more likely to want to respond to other people that they're emotionally invested in. So like if your girlfriend says something to you, you will answer her probably rather than speaking to a stranger. And the result of that was that in play, a player could come into a room where there were two characters that knew each other well, and the player could say something, and the two characters would just kind of continue to talk to one another. And the thing was, like, that is a social situation that happens in real life all the time, is like completely, plausible events, but our players were like, this is so buggy, like, it's totally crap. And so we went in there and actually added a parameter that said, if somebody is played by a human being, then you have to pay attention to them, and put that out, and our players were like, it's much more realistic now. So, that is a thing that arises. So I think that part of the reason that I'm now thinking in terms of what are representations and abstractions that we can create. And I think Rob's point about finding the right level of abstraction that makes it easy for people to write the material that they want to write is super important. And what we're trying to do is figure out what that is, so that when you're writing new pieces of content, you're writing them as sort of meaningful gameplay moves that will therefore, because they have that kind of mechanical juice to them, remain interesting to the player, and not kind of lead people down the path of okay, I'm going to intricately model this emotional state of repressed secret anger, and I'm going to spend days and days carving out what that looks like, but actually I have no way of expressing that as a gameplay item. So I think there's a lot to be done in the space of finding your right abstractions and making your authoring tools really support those.
And I think I might reframe your question a little bit, and rather than thinking of it in terms of human-like AI versus bad AI, I think of it in terms of generativity versus scripting. I don't know any of the internal details of Bethesda games. I'm guessing that the people on the Game AI Programmers Guild would probably say that when you walk into an inn and an NPC comes up to you and says something random that's needed for the plot but doesn't make sense in context, I'm guessing that's actually something that a level designer has scripted in.
I would imagine, yeah, it's some kind of triggers based on the game state and the player state, and leading to a dialogue tree.
Yeah, and so there is in that kind of game, there's oftentimes an ongoing conversation between the AI designers and the level designers over how much autonomy the level designers are comfortable giving over to the AI, because the level design, there really are contexts where the level designers need to make sure that certain things happen, and so they might have a natural inclination to go and script things. On the other hand, then you have to worry about, did they anticipate all the different kinds of conditions that could happen, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's not as much an issue of human-like versus not human-like as generative versus scripted. And the answer is, it's hard and we don't know. Matt?
I just this is sort of a quick one, but for Tarn, you were talking about how a lot of players invest in specific dwarves and specific paintings and specific inns and things like that. Have you thought about maybe messing with them a little bit, planning out if they do, tracking them and seeing oh, they seem to care about this family, this dwarf, this thing in particular, and maybe throwing curveballs at them because they do, some sort of emotional manipulation?
I guess that gets back to the whole sort of drama manager type question, and we're just leaning against that because those things seem to be, they're detectable, and people know they're being played pretty quickly. And but I mean, I think RimWorld has a like different categories of drama management, and yeah, and so I mean, there's certainly room for that. For us, it was. I mean, part of it is a question of extensibility. When you start putting your grooves in the game like that, then you inhibit your future movement. That's the reason we have text graphics as well. So, I mean, I think we're sort of pathologically averse to that kind of thing. I'm not saying it's not a good idea. It's just not my character. I also wanted to say on the Dunbar number a little bit and the kind of environmental, because we got kind of interrupted there. For me, that question is, I mean, it's not just about pheromones and parts of the environment. There's sort of a social environment question. I mean, that comes up then there when you have too many agents. They should form into groups. The groups should be, based on similar properties, and then you can. I mean, when we have aggregated groups of properties, it's still like caring about a character. When we're talking about like law firms and student groups and so forth, those are completely legitimate characters in the game that you care about, and you care about the same way that you care about a character. And if you want to put a face on it, then you can have like the student group leader or the CEO of the law, or the senior partner or whatever in the law firm. And then the number of people or the fact that you don't care about them it become as much of an issue.
Okay, well, thank you. We will resume at 2 p.m. with Lane Nooney. Thank you. That's really neat stuff.
There's much still to be resolved.
I understand. Yes. Well, good luck with it. Love to hear more about it.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to have more of a conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good.
starting the battle, I was thinking to myself, I have a video there.
Alright. Should I take this down or should I just leave it up?
That's yours. That's yours.
Yep.
I'll be ready for the document.
Right there? Okay.
Reminds me I should turn all these kind of